But now I'm delighted to welcome someone who has been on the front lines of fighting the subversion of the British Isles into Airstrip 1 of the European federal superstate. And that, of course, is Brian Gerrish, former naval officer, and, of course, now with the British Constitution Group. And also, I might add, the man who basically was the first to lift the lid on the sinister common purpose organisation which has infested its operatives into every level of British society. So we're going to cover a host of interesting topics today. Brian Gerrish, good morning and welcome to the Alex Jones Show.
Yeah, good morning, Paul, and thank you and Alex and all the rest of the crew for giving me an invite to speak.
Well, you're welcome to be back on the show. First of all, obviously you've been a guest previously, but before we get into the whole Liam Fox issue and the cover-up surrounding that, just tell us about your background and how you first began to uncover groups like Common Purpose and what they were up to in the United Kingdom.
Okay, well, we'll keep it very short. I spent 21 years in the Navy as a warfare officer. I left in 1993. I got involved in a small business, started to become what I'll call a normal person. And then in my home city of Plymouth, which is down in the southwest of England, I started to discover massive fraud and corruption, and much of it was to do with public money. So I started to dig into that more. And strange things began to happen because essentially I started to be threatened and warned off. And I wasn't too impressed with that because I'd always believed that my country was generally law-abiding. But then things came to a head when I tried to start a little project to help give unemployed young people some skills training and some hope from the future. And it was obvious that the local elite did not want this project to happen. And when I started to investigate why, not only did I get threatened more, including death threats, but I discovered a very sinister little organisation called Common Purpose at work. And essentially, I'll say now with hindsight, because it's much easier now to look back and put the pieces together, the reason that I was treated in the way I was treated was because I was trying to help people, I was trying to help create jobs, I was trying to get confidence back into local communities, when unknown to me at the time, the government policy was the exact opposite. It was to destroy jobs, it was to break down communities, and it was to reduce young people to unemployed druggies. So that was the start of it. When I then began to really research into the subject and I began to get very good people helping me, we discovered that this organisation, Common Purpose, which calls itself a charity, but what it was really doing was inserting a very, very dangerous political agenda into everywhere it could get. And Common Purpose was and still is. It's in the political circles, it's in schools, it's in hospitals, it's in the military, and their so-called graduate leaders are pushing forward the overall political agenda which is causing such problem. Now, when you were setting up the show, somebody mentioned communism. We're not fighting communism, we're fighting something much more dangerous. It's Gramsci is the man we should be looking at. We should be looking at Saul Alinsky, and we should be looking at Gramsci, because this is Marxism, which is being imposed on America and Britain, and it's being done slowly, gently, piece by piece, in a very hidden, subversive way. But that is, in my view, is the ideology which Common Purpose is pushing.
Now, a lot of these issues can be found at Brian's website, and they actually publish a newspaper which I encourage people to subscribe to, and it's ukcolumn.org. Now, for our American audience who perhaps aren't aware of this, and if you're not, then you need to be, because it's very much a transatlantic controversy, And it takes on even more prominence given the news yesterday that Britain is basically now on a war footing to support the planned US and/or Israeli strike on Iran. And this was a major story last month in the United Kingdom, and it was, of course, the resignation of British Defence Secretary Liam Fox, which came as a result of his relationship with the lobbyist and all-round globalist insider Adam Werrity. And, of course, Werrity, it turns out, was the frontman for this Atlantic Bridge Group, which in itself was funded by the Israeli lobby BICOM, with Werrity actually attending government meetings side by side with the British Defence Secretary on behalf of this pro-Israeli neocon faction. Of course, it led to Fox having to resign. Brian, this Werrity, Fox, Atlantic Bridge, BICOM issue, I mean, the tentacles run deep. It was almost universally ignored by the British press, who merely concentrated on the fact that Fox had broke some ministerial code. They weren't interested about everything else that was going on behind the scenes. And we'll certainly get into some of that later. But just how deep does this scandal with Liam Fox, Werrity, and all these shadowy lobbyist groups run?
Well, the answer to that is it runs very deep. I'll just pick up on your point of what the British media did at the time. It was very interesting to watch what happened because most of the British media just simply focused on Liam Fox's relationship with Werrity as his best man, and the fact that they dressed very in a similar style and they clearly stayed with each other on a regular basis. So many of the press articles focused on the fact that there seemed to be a rather interesting and some would say unnatural relationship between Liam Fox and his best man. But one or two papers started to dig a bit deeper. But when they produced articles, the articles contained information, but it was very confusing. It was very hard to piece together what they were actually talking about. And I can say that we and a large number of other people have done a lot of research on this. And if I may, I'll just take listeners through some of the things that we now know. So if we set the scene, we've got British Secretary of State for Defence, Liam Fox. He chooses his best man as a personal advisor, and his best man actually makes out that he is a bona fide government advisor, and he then accompanies his best mate, Mr. Fox, on tours and missions around the world. So there was instant deception that you had somebody who was not security cleared being touted as if they were part of the British government. That was Mr. Werrity. But Werrity had set up a number of organisations which we really need to look at very closely, and certainly Americans need to look at this very closely, because these are the tentacles that are working very hard to drag both Britain and America into further wars. But I'll just add at this point that, of course, Britain almost has no armed forces left. Most Americans will simply not understand how big the cuts have been on British military. So when our Prime Minister David Cameron is talking about wars against Iran, it's not going to be a major effort by the British. It's going to be American lives that are lost fighting Cameron's warmongering. But if I just bring you back to Mr. Werrity, Paul has already mentioned Atlantic Bridge, which was a so-called charity to help drive and improve relations between Britain and America. But that charity was actually closed down by the formal body in UK because it was highly political. And under the charity rules in the United Kingdom, you can't be political if you're a charity. So the Atlantic Bridge organisation was fraudulent itself. And when you look behind, we find, for example, people like John Falk, who's a US defence lobbyist, linked in with an organisation called Kestrel in the USA, which is ultimately linked through to Blackwater or Z. So we're not seeing just an innocent best man who happened to set up a charity to help relations with Britain and America. We're seeing a man who's intimately connected in with what I regard as international mercenary organisations. One of the papers that added a bit more was the Independent on Sunday, because they ran an article which was actually front page, and it said that Werrity, and let's remember, he is the man right alongside the then Secretary of State for Defence in Britain, Mr. Fox. Their headline said that Werrity plotted with Mossad to target Iran. So what was happening at the time the Leanne Fox scandal came to the surface was that it was clear that in the background work was going on in order to help start some form of conflict with Iran. And it was very interesting that another British paper, the Daily Mail, ran some paragraphs in which it said that many officials in the Ministry of Defence in Britain were becoming very, very concerned because they knew that people were acting in a private capacity to influence defence. It's more like offence policy. And they also warned that Mossad was using useful idiots in the British government in order to help foment trouble on the world stage. So it was really quite interesting that if you did look right the way across the media, you could find a lot of information, but it was all in bits. There were other names that came forward in this scandal. One of them was Matthew Gould, the UK ambassador to Israel. He's an interesting character because he was originally the private parliamentary secretary to David Miliband. Of course, we've now got one of the Miliband brothers, Ed Miliband, who's leading the Labour Party in Britain. If we delve into his background, he comes from an absolutely dedicated Marxist family. So there's another little interesting bit. We find venture capitalists who donate £125,000 to the Conservative Party. But the real meat of it is in relation to an organisation called Pargav. And this effectively was a lobbying group that Adam Werrity had set up. And once we start to look at Pargav, we find not effectively, because it's been reported in the press, but it's been hidden. We have a Finnish-Israeli arms dealer who's worth some £2 billion. We have him connected to Pargav, and we learn that he donated £15,000 for Cameron's leadership campaign. So here we have David Cameron, who appears out of nowhere, we call him a toff schoolboy from Eton. He suddenly appears as the British Prime Minister, and now we're seeing that the type of people who funded his leadership campaign are major international arms dealers. But it gets better than that, because we can start to actually see that there are other groups involved. So there's the Thamires Investment Group, which was paying money into Pargav as well. And that company owns, it is said, about 40% of the major property in Las Vegas. Casinos, it's got property in Washington, New York, Times Square. So the people who are clustered around Mr. Werrity and therefore intimately linked with Mr. Fox are certainly major and extremely wealthy people, including arms dealers. But we can get in a little bit deeper on this, because there was also a hedge fund called CQS involved. This was also linked through a man called Oliver Hilton into Pargav, and CQS invested some £21.5 million in a high-tech firm called L3. And when Mr. Fox scrapped Britain's Nimrods, these are equivalent to the the American maritime patrol aircraft, such as the then P-3. They're the same age. But the moment those aircraft were scrapped, they cut the wings off them, they destroyed all the simulators. But by an amazing coincidence, they were then replaced by 3 Boeing RC-135 aircraft worth $650 million, and those aircraft came from L3. So you can see that there was wheeling and dealing going on with absolutely massive UK defence contracts that were being done through the back door by Mr. Werrity and his organisation Pargav and Pargav Limited. So the major press, which has convinced people in Britain that it's a little bit of maybe slap and tickle between Mr. Fox and his best man, this is a smokescreen, because what has gone on in the background is absolutely massive arms deals. But of course, it's also exposed that David Cameron has been levered into power by international arms dealers.
And I mean, as you said, this just opened up a can of worms that never ends. There was another group which was connected to this scandal, which I mentioned at the start. You had Werrity, of course, with Atlantic Bridge, but Atlantic Bridge, one of its main funders is this Israeli BICOM lobbyist groups, and from what I can see, no mainstream establishment newspaper has done a story on this astounding revelation, which came out in a leaked email, which was mistakenly sent by BICOM CEO, this Israeli lobby group, to the press. And in this email, Brian, they brazenly boast about how they've penetrated BBC News and Sky News as a means of, quote, ensuring the most objectively favourable line was taken, end quote, in relation to a pro-Israeli stance in the news. Here's another quote in this leaked email. After contact with BICOM media team, Sky News changed their narrative in explaining the prior events in the region which led up to this weekend, and they're talking about the siege on the Israeli embassy back in September. So this group that funds Werrity's Atlantic Bridge, in their own emails, brag about how, I mean, there's another one where they talk about they have a meeting with the BBC News editor. There's another quote where they say, quote, I briefed Jonathan Ford, the Financial Times lead writer, for his upcoming article. I briefed him. It's not that they gave him a quote or an interview. This lobby group is briefing our journalists, BBC, Sky News, Financial Times, on what to report. And they brag about how they made them change their narrative about certain events. And this is the group linked to Werrity's Atlantic Bridge. So, I mean, Brian, we've caught them red-handed. This is how talking points in the media are generated. It's about how they dictate reality to us. So, I mean, what does this say about the so-called impartiality of the likes of the BBC and Sky News, that they're being briefed by pro-Israeli lobby groups?
Well, this is absolutely correct. I'd just like to say at this point, because I think it is an important thing to talk about. We're here talking about Israeli interests. The principal interest for us is what our own ministers are doing intermixing with these people. I can at the moment just sort of put a wall down and say the Israelis, separate country, whatever they want to do, they can get on and do it. We may not agree with all of it, but at the moment in Britain we are focusing on what our own politicians are doing, being bought or directed by these people. When I voted when I have voted in national elections, I don't ever remember voting on a basis that I wanted people who were actually working for Israel coming into my country. Now, the key man in this, Mr. Zabludowicz, was the man who was intimately linked with the British Israel Communications and Research Centre, and he donated some £800,000 to them. So we're not talking about small institutions who are short of a bit of money. we're talking about people who are directing sums of billions of pounds or billions of dollars, and they are capable of buying whole organisations and government, never mind a few individual people. But if you dig into BICOM, you very quickly find Mr. Fox's smiling face at their events. And the other important thing to realise is that this activity is not related to one party. It's not related to the British Conservative Party, because we've got individuals like Hazel Blear's MP for the Labour side, who's also intimately involved with them. In fact, I can also say that Michael Gove, who's now our Education Secretary, is another man who is happy to come under the BICOM fold. So I think that what we're really starting to ask is who are these people who are now in our Parliament, and who are they working for? And the UK column, we did it as a very measured article, but we ran an article which pointed out that David Cameron said that he would never break his allegiance to Israel. That was above everything. And so we said to him, can you explain to us, Mr. Cameron, how you can be the Prime Minister of Britain, which should be your ultimate responsibility, and in fact what you're saying is that your primary responsibility is to Israel? I believe that what we are seeing, well, I'm sure what we're seeing in the British Parliament at the moment, is utter treason. And we need to expose these people for what they really are, which is the spawn of international arms dealers. And of course, what do international arms dealers like? And it's very simple. They like wars and bloodshed because that's how they make their profit. So to now see this I can't really describe him in the right way, this horrible man, Cameron, calling on America to start yet another war to start millions of deaths. I hope that the average American citizen out there, and certainly the people listening to this show, start to think to themselves, we don't need American deaths in order to satisfy Mr. Cameron's personal ambitions.
It's amazing, and I mean, you talk about, you know, we don't vote for people to be influenced by Israeli lobbyists. It doesn't matter what country they come from. Russian lobbyists, any kind of outside influence whatsoever, it's a violation of sovereignty. It's the complete opposite of representational democracy, and it's got no business being in our country. I mean, this Lorna Fitzsimmons of this BICOM group, she bragged it. I mean, these quotes just keep coming. Quote, public opinion does not influence foreign policy in Britain. Foreign policy is an elite issue. So that again goes to the core of what you're saying with these people. Outsiders coming in and directing our foreign policy at odds to what the British people actually want.
Yep.
Switching gears, Brian, though, yeah. And I want to get onto the child abuse issue in a moment, but we had this big story a couple of months ago. What do you think about YouTube pulling down the video of the protest at Birkenhead where members of your group attempted to arrest the judge due to a, quote, government removal request? That's what YouTube said, and they pulled the video. Well,
just to set the scene for listeners, a few months ago, in a totally peaceful demonstration, 600 people on the streets up in the Midlands in UK. Basically, a judge was arrested for running an unlawful court. Now, of course, the police did what we would expect of the police, which is that the police ended up defending the judge. He wasn't harmed, he wasn't assaulted anyway, but he was simply informed he was being put under arrest by the public because he was running an unlawful court. Now, you're quite right, because video footage of that was taken down with a statement that it was the government taking it down. This is highly significant, and I personally believe it's wonderful, it's excellent, because what it has shown, and people understand the meaning, is the government is terrified of what people can do when they they've got proper knowledge and understanding of what's happening in their country. So the British government was so terrified of what 600 peaceful protesters did in Birkenhead near Liverpool that they had to remove the video. Of course, on the day itself, despite 600 people being on the streets, about 40 police vehicles, I don't know how many hundred police with dog handlers and some riot police in the background. On the day, there was not a single report in any of the British mainstream media. The BBC didn't cover it. None of the ITV, the independent channels, covered it. There was simply one local radio station that published what had happened. Now, this was obviously a media clampdown. And why would you need a media clampdown? Because the government is terrified of the truth coming out about the corruption in British courts and the fact that ordinary people are now starting to move to sort the problem out themselves. So that's what it's about.
As he said, I mean, it just represents to me how much of a blind panic they're in, that they have to remove this video from the internet. And their excuse is, oh, you can't show footage of a court in session. I mean, the court wasn't even in session, and most of the video was of the protest outside. So again, that was just an excuse. And I mean, doesn't it show the fact that they're petrified of people understanding how, in this example, Roger Hayes, with the whole council tax issue, people can beat them at their own game. And I mean, that really goes to the heart of why they're so afraid, because if everyone else learns about how people are being successful in fighting it, then it's rapidly going to get out of control from their perspective.
Well, I think, Paul, that I know the Alex Jones show is pushing out a lot of good information for people about what is actually happening, and we are trying to do the same. But I think something very, very interesting has happened in the last 6 months. You can now feel, you can see, if you're looking in the right place, that we are starting, this is all the people, thousands, millions of people who are starting to wake up. We are now starting to drive our own governments because they also know people are waking up, and that is why we're suddenly seeing the rush through of all this very hard-hitting, draconian legislation to clamp down on American people and to clamp down on British people. They are now going flat out to introduce the dictatorships in Britain and America. And the reason they're having to rush is because of the rate we are now exposing what they're doing. And the beauty is, the more they do and the faster they do it, the more obvious it is to people that something is very wrong. So I think we've as well as getting out the message of all the terrible things that are happening at the moment, we've also very much got to focus on the positive things and where we're having successes. And one of the things that we know in Britain is we can't get justice, we can't bring treasonous politicians to justice because the courts are utterly corrupt. And one British MP called John Hemming, who came to an event we put on the weekend before last, was happy to stand on stage and be filmed saying that the British courts and judiciary are corrupt. So we've got to deal with these corrupt courts and these corrupt judges if we are going to get democracy and proper law and order restored in our countries.
And that tipping point is going to be more likely the more the number of insiders, like the MP you just mentioned, come out and speak out against that. But I mean, readers of the UK column are well aware of, switching gears for the next topic, the fact that you've covered this serial state kidnapping of children for years now, and for our American audience, if you think the CPS is bad in the United States, then this certainly rivals it. We're talking about no court order, barely any legal process in many cases. Police, from the stories I read, literally hunting down cars in the middle of the night to snatch babies from parents. I mean, Brian, we've read cases in the media about, taking so-called obese children from parents, and the media will report on that at length. But what you've reported in the UK column is something that can only represent a deliberate assault on the family unit by the state with these kind of child kidnappings, child abduction, and eventually child abuse. I mean, tell us why this is happening in the UK and why it's so prevalent.
Well, you've made that very easy for me, because all we have to do is bring listeners back and get them focused on Saul Alinsky in particular, and also Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist. You don't need to read huge books. You can go on the internet and just Google both of them. And what you will find these men talking about is getting in to destroy traditional democracies, to destroy traditional communities by getting in and destroying families, and particularly Christian families. And their tactics are, instead of guns and bombs and bullets, you actually infiltrate into the establishment, the system itself, and then you do the damage from the inside. But the family unit, the heterosexual family unit, was always their primary target, because if you can break up mothers and fathers, mums and dads, and you can take the children, then those children can be groomed straight into the new political ideology. And what we've got to do is put the scale of this. Remember that Britain is a much smaller country than America, but we're dealing with, at the moment, with over 60,000 children who are actually have been taken away from their parents. The children are being taken inside courts where there are no juries, where the press is not allowed to be. So these are secret courts. Their Star Chamber is the correct word in Britain for them. They are secret courts. The evidence brought in is falsified. Psychiatrist reports, psychologist reports contain lies, false information. They are factually incorrect. And it doesn't matter what the parents do inside the court, their children are taken from them. And again, we know that the government in UK is beginning to get very fearful of the speed at which the information is coming out, because in the last 2 days, a gentleman called David Norgrove has published his report on family justice, and he's actually saying that the whole process should be speeded up. In particular, he's saying that if a couple breaks up, the father should not have automatic access to his own children. And he's also saying, this man, that grandparents who actually get involved when couples break up and say, we can look after the children, that those grandparents are actually doing damage to the children, and they should be cut out. Now, David Cameron, let's stay focused on David Cameron, because this man is so dangerous. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, is backing a report which says that fathers should be denied access to their children. This is the work of Gramsci, and of course David Cameron is not a conservative in any shape or form. He is a subversive. I personally regard him as a domestic extremist, and what he is doing is implanting Gramscian ideology. So this is why we're having such an amazing attack on families, and thousands of children are being taken away, because if we can break down the family, then the state can claim the children. It's as simple as that.
And I mean, this goes to the very heart of broken Britain, which is this phrase we hear constantly. Most people don't realise that it's been deliberately broken. If it's broken, then somebody's going to put it back together again, and you can bet that that's going to be the state. And a shining example of what it leads to is what we witnessed in the UK back in August, which was the riots. Now, I'm guessing, Brian, that came as a completely expected to you. I mean, your newspaper's been predicting widespread social unrest. I predicted it in articles I wrote 2 years ago. So I'm guessing that the riots, which started in London and spread across major cities back in August, didn't come as a surprise to you.
Oh, well, absolutely not. And it was very easy to see within a few hours, but certainly within 24 hours, that these were not spontaneous riots from people who'd had enough. It just didn't stack up. We know how difficult it is to organise people across the country, and here we had the British government saying that riots were being organised in not only London but other cities across UK, that these riots were being organised by young black teenagers using BlackBerry phones. This is absolute nonsense. What was actually happening was the violence was being created by government agitators, and we also know from residents in some of the areas where the riots took place that they watched police deliberately held back so that they didn't intervene, and the thing then grew. The trouble on the streets grew. So somebody was ordering the police, let's stand back, let's allow this thing to grow, let's kick it off. And we've got better information than that, because some British policemen, and these are brilliant people because they're so brave, they have actually been leaking information that when they were taken into an area where the rioting had started, they saw other so-called police units who they didn't recognise. They had no idea what units these really were. They had no idea where the people had come from. And in many cases, they were talking about so-called policemen who didn't have any formal number or name identity on them. So we have British policemen who are themselves now starting to blow the whistle on the fact that when there is trouble on the streets, there are agitators who are being moved into position, via our own policing system. So this is very, very dangerous, because we have now got government-backed agitation. And if listeners are thinking, where do they want to take this? I'll give my opinion. So this is just Brian Gerrish's opinion on this one. They want absolute major violence on the streets of Britain, because if they can create that major violence, they will bring in the Civil Contingencies Act, which is roughly equivalent to the American Patriot Act. The moment the Civil Contingencies Act is in place, we are living in a dictatorship. So whenever we're giving talks as the UK column or the British Constitution Group, we're constantly warning that we need people to be peaceful. We don't need fights between blacks and whites or Muslims or Christians, whatever the groups are. If we fight amongst ourselves, the criminals who are in power in the Senate in America and Congress and in Westminster in Britain, those criminals win. We've got to be smarter than violence at the moment. We've got to keep it calm and peaceful, and we've got to get the truth out about how our countries are being destroyed from the inside.
And I mean, just to back you up, we actually did a story in regard to the riots where Twitter users were reporting that men claiming to represent the media were actually driving around the streets and paying them to riot, paying them to break shop windows, as he said, paying them to become agitators. So, I mean, those riots, obviously, after it went on the social meme and it was on the news every night. You had copycats going out and doing the same thing. But the genesis of those riots, as you said, was definitely provocateur in many ways. Extrapolating this out, just about the general state of Britain, Brian, perhaps the best way to frame that is to ask, what do groups like Common Purpose want to turn Britain into, and how far have they got down that path?
Well, very simply, Common Purpose wants to create a new society. It doesn't ever define the society properly, because this is how the con works. If you said to people, join Common Purpose, and we are working to overturn present society, and we want to create a new society that's going to be governed by a political elite, most people would run away. So what Common Purpose is doing is being very, very devious. It's sucking people into courses where it's giving them an education to impose this new ideology on them. And we know how it is being done, and I really would ask listeners to go away and research this for themselves. The way they are doing it is to use NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. This is a form, technically it's a form of hypnosis, but these are very, very, very sophisticated techniques of messing around with people's minds. And although NLP can be used to help people, it can be used in therapeutic ways. What we are seeing is NLP being used to promote a very dangerous political agenda, and it's being used to change people's views and values without them actually being aware of it. Now, if you say to me, how bad has it got, I'm going to be able to say with total confidence, because the UK column has published this stuff in detail, we've now got Common Purpose embedded at the highest level of government. One of Cameron's ministers who's helping promote it is Oliver Letwin, who I'll say just happens to be an ex-MN Rothschild man. But we've got Common Purpose, which is a political charity. I know that I've already said earlier that it's not possible to be political, but I'm sure they are. They are now bedded straight into the government cabinet office, and they have been put under contract to help set up behavioural change units in every government department. Now, this is not fantasy, this is fact. We've got the documents, we know the names, we know when the meetings took place. So in the UK at the moment, every key government department has a cell which is tasked, first of all, with changing the views and values and behaviour of the government department people. And when they've achieved that, the departments are going to use the same effects on us to change our views and values in society. Now, the government's own documents, and I'll quote one of them, which is called Mindspace. Mindspace, you can find it on Google. In that document, it actually admits that the psychological processes they're using, the NLP they're using, can change our views and values and beliefs. We may not even know that those things have been changed. These modern applied psychology tools are so powerful, we can have our views changed. We're not even aware the views changed. Alternatively, we might realise we're changed, we're doing different things, but we don't know how it was done to us. Now, that's not Brian Gerrish telling the audience that. That has come straight out of government documents. So let's start to put this together. We've got in Britain, and the same thing's happening in America, we have international criminals who have now wormed their way. We've been stupid enough to elect them, but they're now in positions of power in government. They're linked to arms dealers. They're calling for wars throughout the world. And these people are prepared to use applied psychology on their own citizens in order to get their agenda through. This is very, very dangerous stuff, and we've got to take the lid off it.
And I mean, NLP, which you were talking about before, goes right to the heart of what you just said. It's about manipulating behaviour. It's about certain phrases and emphasis on words. And this is used in advertising, it's used in speeches, it's used in politics. And it's about trying to get people to do what you want them to do, get them to think what you want them to think by the words that you use. I mean, it's sold as a self-help tool, and I'm sure a lot of people do use it for that, but it's been hijacked and it's now being used for nefarious ends. Just
right,
as
Paul, sorry to
yeah,
cut
go
in,
ahead.
but if I may, because I'm watching the time, something I'd like to bring to the attention of the American audience is that in South Wales, South Wales being obviously part of the United Kingdom, over the last 2 years, in a very small geographic area, we now have over 40 teenagers, very young teenagers and young people committing suicide. It's been going on for 2 years. The suicides are still continuing. And what is so terrible is these are children aged 14, 15, 16, and up through to sort of young 20s. And the method of suicide is that they are all hanging themselves. Now, this is not a very nice topic, but we're in very dangerous times at the moment. When we look at the suicides and we see they're all hanging themselves, this is unusual, because the facts are, statistically, that boys normally hang themselves or men hang themselves, whereas girls and women take drugs and maybe cut their wrists. But these people are all hanging themselves. Now, at the moment, the British government has put a media clampdown on these suicides because they do not want people in Britain to realise that something very, very nasty is happening with young people. But when we dig into what is actually happening in this area of South Wales, we find there is a massive infiltration of not only Common Purpose, but other organisations which are using applied NLP within the school system. Now, I can speak with confidence on this because we actually now have NLP trainers, people who are professional trainers in NLP. They have come forward to us to give us information because they are absolutely horrified that what they regard as a therapeutic skill is being unleashed on children in a political sense. Now, what one of these professional NLP people explained to me, and I think it's a very, very good analogy, if you buy yourself a new computer, and it's a very fast machine and you're very pleased with it, this is like the human brain. It's working well. And then you add a program, and everything's fine, and you add a few more programs, and then you fancy a game, and you add a couple of computer games. And after you've added so many things into your computer, eventually you get the odd problem. It freezes or it stops. And if you really overload it with lots of little screensavers and games and programs, eventually you can have major problems with your computer until you get it cleaned out. Now, what the NLP trainer explained to me is that if you start to put in NLP clips, NLP programs, into the minds of children and young people, you do a bit in this lesson, a bit in that lesson, a bit in next year's lesson, eventually you get problems. And his view, and I think he's absolutely correct, is that we are now starting to see the political pushing of applied behavioural psychology. This is now starting to result in our young people committing suicide. This is very dangerous stuff, and exactly the same processes are being used in American schools.
And it's interesting you touch upon that subject because a couple of weeks ago I wrote an article about demos, which of course is the the think tank of which Cameron regularly gives speeches, so did Tony Blair, founded by Marxists. Julia Middleton, who of course is majorly involved with Common Purpose, sits on their board. And there was a story recently about Demos sending their agents out to schools to basically train them how to judge sources. And of course, anything designated as a, quote, conspiracy theory, anything that disagrees with the official orthodoxy, was denigrated and rubbished. So they're actually sending out Demos people to train school children to dismiss anything that goes against the government line. And we actually had one of the Demos employees on the Alex Jones Nightly News after, and of course he denied everything. From my perspective, it seemed like he was just working at the lower level. He's got no idea what the overall organisation is about, although he did admit that Demos is funded by the British government. So of course that's going to have an influence on what they're allowed to do and what kind of programmes they're allowed to bring to schools and introduce to the curriculum.
Yep.
But one more thing,
Sorry,
Brian,
Paul.
and we've got a few minutes before we end here.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we did an article on these Common Purpose promo videos which were on YouTube a couple of years ago. Really downright creepy stuff. They had shots of, they were talking about Common Purpose, then they cut to shots of people involved in the program, you know, wide-eyed, looked completely drugged out of their gourds, looked like they were brainwashed. I wrote an article saying, look at this is weird, this is creepy. Lo and behold, the YouTube account related to these videos has now been deleted. So they seem, I mean, Common Purpose had a thing on their website recently saying, you know, attacking you, basically saying what you say is all rubbish. But it's very interesting when you point out these things, they seem to get very nervous and start to remove material. Is that the case from what your experience?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. But let's look at this on a positive side. If these people have nothing to hide, they should be very proud of all their material up. The fact that when you lift the stone, you shine the spotlight on them, they start to backtrack, instantly tells you they're up to no good. So I'm delighted when stuff gets taken down, because what the government is doing for free is telling us that we're beginning to look in the right areas. We're beginning to look in the right direction. And just to come back to Demos very quickly, I'm really glad that you mentioned Demos is a Marxist organisation, and it is right next to the British government. It's a policy creation think tank. It has advised Labour, it's advised the Liberal Democrats, and now it's interwoven into the so-called Conservative government. And yes, you're absolutely right, Julia Middleton linked to Demos. So everywhere we now turn, where the country, Britain and America, is being ripped apart, it's being done because the Marxist ideology has been let loose inside the country. Well, we've got very, very brave American men and women serving their country in the American armed forces, and they think they're out there on the front line defending their country. What is actually going on is that the Marxists have put their people in power straight into Congress, straight into the Senate, and in Britain straight into Westminster. We know who these people are. In Britain we certainly know who they are, and all we've got to do is remove them. Is it possible? I'm going to say it's going to start to happen very quickly, and the beauty of it is that initially I think things will get a little bit ugly, but the longer we keep it peaceful, the faster the truth comes out, and the quicker these people start running. You only had to see the fear on Liam Fox's face when he started to be exposed in the press. So if you want to know how to hurt these people, how to get rid of them, you've got to name them. You've got to get you've got to get their photographs into the media, onto the internet, and we've got to name them for what they are. They are dangerous criminals. They're Marxists. Many of them are child abusers, certainly in the British political circles, and we need to expose them for what they really are. If we do that, we can overcome what's happening.
And just to conclude, Brian, give people the websites, tell them how they can get involved with the British Constitution Group, UK Column, etc.
Okay. Well, the UK Column is a newspaper, is a voluntary newspaper, but we're reporting on what's happening in the country, and we're analysing it, and that is simply www.ukcolumn, that's COLUMN, www.ukcolumn.org, O-R-G. The British Constitution Group, which is showing how our common law and constitution is being undermined, is www.thebcgroup, all one word, thebcgroup.org.uk. And if you go to either of those sites, you'll start to see what we're about. And if you're interested in common purpose, I have another site which is called cpexposed.com, www.cpexposed.com. That is going to get a big update fairly shortly, but there's a lot of information on common purpose. And can I just lastly say that this coming Saturday, the British Constitution Group has got a big talk in London in which we are going to be exposing the traitors in Westminster. And in the evening at 5:30, there are big demonstrations planned by Anonymous and Occupy London, and these are people who have now decided to come out on the streets and protest against the criminals in Parliament. So I doubt if much of it will come out on mainstream press, but I hope Paul and Alex, the Alex Jones show, will cover some of that event.
Okay, Brian Gerrish, we'll get this interview on YouTube, be seen by tens of thousands of people. We'll get the information out. Really appreciate you joining me this morning, and you've got my email address. As soon as you want to come on again, just shoot me an email, and we'll get you on again with Alex. Brian Gerrish, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, there goes Brian Gerrish, ukcolumn.org.